The email arrived at 6:47 in the morning, while Daniel Cole was still standing at his kitchen counter in a wrinkled button-down, pouring cereal into a bowl for his daughter with one hand and scrolling his phone with the other. The subject line had 3 words. NASA needs you. He read it twice, set the phone down on the counter like it might explode, and picked it back up again. His daughter, Lily, 8 years old with 2 missing front teeth, looked up at him and asked why his hands were shaking. He told her it was nothing. But 3 days earlier, in a glass-walled conference room 40 floors above downtown Houston, a man worth $400 million had stood in front of the entire engineering staff and told Daniel, in front of everyone, that his degree wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. Nobody in that room could have imagined how fast the tables were about to turn. Daniel Cole had been a structural analyst at Halcyon Aerospace Dynamics for 6 years. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear a Rolex or drive anything newer than a 2014 Camry with 200,000 miles on it. He showed up early, stayed late when he could afford the babysitter, and kept a photo of his late wife, Sarah, taped inside his desk drawer where only he could see it. Sarah had died 4 years earlier, a drunk driver on a rain-slicked highway, and since then it had just been Daniel and Lily, figuring out the world one exhausted day at a time. He'd gone to community college because that was what he could afford after burying his wife and raising a 5-year-old alone. 2 years at Houston Community College, transferred credits, finished his engineering degree part-time while working nights. It took him 6 years instead of 4. Nobody handed him anything. At Halcyon, Daniel had built a quiet reputation among the people who actually mattered, the senior engineers who trusted his instincts on load calculations and material stress points. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't need to be. But that reputation meant nothing to the man who had just taken over the company 3 months earlier, a 34-year-old named Marcus Whitfield, son of the firm's founder, fresh off a leadership rotation at a hedge fund and holding an MBA from a school he mentioned in almost every sentence. Marcus believed in pedigree. He believed in Ivy League transcripts and country club connections and the kind of confidence that came from never once being told no. And when he looked at Daniel Cole's personnel file, all he saw was a 2-year associate's degree wedged in before a state university diploma, like a stain he couldn't quite scrub out. The meeting that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. Halcyon was bidding on a subcontract tied to a next-generation thermal shielding project, work that would eventually feed into aerospace applications far beyond anything the company had touched before. Marcus had personally selected the lead engineer for the proposal, a Stanford graduate named Preston Wexler who had exactly 18 months of field experience and an ego considerably larger than that. Preston's design used a ceramic composite layering technique that looked beautiful on paper, clean, symmetrical, exactly the kind of thing that photographed well in a pitch deck. Daniel raised his hand halfway through the presentation. He said, quietly, that the thermal expansion rates in the outer layer didn't account for microfracturing under repeated rapid heating and cooling cycles, the kind of stress a re-entry vehicle would experience, and that the material would begin delaminating within a fraction of the expected mission lifespan. The room went still. Marcus Whitfield didn't like being contradicted, and he liked it even less in front of 40 employees and 2 board members. He asked Daniel, with a small, cold smile, where exactly he'd developed such sophisticated expertise in advanced composite materials. Daniel told him the truth, that he'd studied it independently, that he'd built on foundational coursework from Houston Community College and years of self-directed research since. Marcus laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, it was worse than that, a short, dismissive huff that told everyone in the room exactly what he thought. He said, and people in that room would repeat this line for weeks afterward, that he wasn't going to let his company's flagship pitch be second-guessed by someone whose most advanced credential came from a 2-year school people attended when they couldn't get in anywhere else. He told Daniel to sit down and let the real engineers finish. A few people in the room actually laughed along with him. Others just stared at their laptops, unwilling to make eye contact with either man. Daniel sat down. He didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. But something in his jaw had tightened, something that wouldn't fully let go for days. That night, After Lily was asleep, Daniel sat in the converted garage he used as a workspace, surrounded by 3 second-hand monitors and a corkboard covered in printouts, and he did what he always did when the world made him feel small. He worked. For the past 2 years, in the hours after his daughter went to bed, Daniel had been quietly developing an alternative thermal protection framework of his own, not for any company, not for any paycheck, just because the problem fascinated him and because working on something bigger than his own bad days kept him sane. He'd published 2 technical papers under his own name on an open-access engineering research platform, the kind of niche academic corner that almost nobody outside the field ever reads. His approach used a graded density composite that flexed instead of cracked under thermal cycling, a solution to almost exactly the failure mode he tried to warn Marcus about that afternoon. He didn't think about it as revenge. He thought about it as the only thing that made him feel like himself. 600 miles away, at a NASA contractor facility outside Houston working on a classified re-entry vehicle program, a materials engineer named Dr. Priya Anand was running out of options. Her team had spent 14 months developing a heat shield system for an upcoming crewed mission, and every design kept failing the same way in simulation, delaminating under thermal stress exactly the way Daniel had predicted in that boardroom. They were 3 weeks from a hard deadline with the review board, and every internal proposal had hit the same wall. Desperate, one of her junior researchers pulled up an obscure paper during a late-night literature search, an independently published piece on graded density thermal composites, written by someone with no institutional affiliation listed at all. Priya read it twice. Then she read it a third time, at 2 a.m, sitting alone in her office with her coffee gone cold. She picked up her phone and called her program director. She said, "I think I just found our answer, and I have no idea who this guy actually is." It took NASA's team 4 days to track Daniel down, because he'd never claimed any professional title on his published work, just his name and an email address he barely checked. When Priya finally reached him by phone, she introduced herself, explained the program, and asked if he'd be willing to fly out for a technical consultation, possibly to help adapt his framework for an active mission-critical application. Daniel sat there in his kitchen holding the phone, Lily's cereal bowl still on the counter, and for a long moment he genuinely thought it was a prank. Priya had to repeat herself twice before it landed. She told him NASA didn't care where his degree came from. She told him they cared that his math was right when everyone else's was wrong. Daniel hung up the phone and stood there in the quiet kitchen for a full minute before he let himself cry. News like that doesn't stay quiet, not in an industry as small and gossip-hungry as aerospace engineering. Within 2 days, word had reached Halcyon Aerospace Dynamics that NASA's contractor team had requested Daniel Cole specifically, by name, for a classified consultation related to a mission thermal system. Not the company. Not the department. Him. Marcus Whitfield heard about it in a phone call from one of the board members, who wanted to know why NASA was reaching out to one of Halcyon's junior analysts instead of going through official channels with the executive team. Marcus, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, didn't have a smooth answer ready. He called Daniel into his office that same afternoon, and the shift in his posture was almost comical. The same man who a week earlier had laughed him out of a meeting now sitting up a little too straight, trying to recalibrate in real time. He asked Daniel, carefully, what exactly NASA wanted with him. Daniel told him. He explained the paper, the framework, the graded density solution, the same delamination problem he'd flagged in the meeting that Marcus had waved away in front of 40 people. He watched Marcus's face change as the pieces clicked together, the realization crawling across his expression that the man he'd humiliated over a community college degree had been sitting on the exact solution his multi-million-dollar Stanford hire couldn't produce. Marcus tried to recover. He said something about how impressive it was, how the company would obviously want to support this opportunity, how maybe they could position it as a Halcyon-led initiative. Daniel just looked at him. He said, quietly, that NASA hadn't called Halcyon. They'd called him. The formal consultation happened 2 weeks later, in a secure conference room that made the glass tower at Halcyon look like a strip mall office. Daniel walked in wearing the same style of button-down he always wore, no tie, no watch worth mentioning, carrying a battered laptop bag that had been his wife's before it was his. Priya Anand met him at the door personally and shook his hand like he was someone whose name she'd been saying out loud for weeks, because she had been. Inside the room sat senior engineers, program directors, people with decades of institutional pedigree stacked behind their names, and every single one of them had read his papers before he walked in. Nobody asked him where he went to school. Somebody did ask him, early in the meeting, how he'd developed the graded density approach in the first place, and Daniel told them honestly. He said he'd started thinking about material stress and failure points differently after watching things break that weren't supposed to break, in his life and in his work, and that he'd just kept asking why until the math started making sense. The room was quiet for a different reason this time. Over the following months, Daniel's framework became a foundational piece of the mission's revised thermal protection system. He was brought on as a paid technical consultant, then offered a permanent position on the program, one that came with a salary nearly triple what Halcyon had ever paid him and benefits that meant Lily's future was, for the first time since Sarah died, something he didn't have to lie awake worrying about. Halcyon Aerospace Dynamics, meanwhile, quietly lost the subcontract bid they'd pinned so much hope on, in part because the board had grown uneasy watching their own CEO get publicly outmaneuvered by an employee he'd mocked in a meeting that half the office had already turned into office legend. Preston Wexler's original ceramic design was scrapped entirely. Marcus Whitfield tried, for a while, to spin the story internally as a Halcyon success, a company that had nurtured hidden talent, but nobody who'd been in that boardroom that Tuesday was buying it, and eventually a few of them said so, loudly enough that it reached the board. 6 months later, Marcus was no longer CEO. The company brought in someone else, someone with considerably less interest in where a person's degree came from and considerably more interest in whether their math checked out. Daniel didn't celebrate any of that. He wasn't the kind of man who needed someone else to lose in order to feel like he'd won. What he did instead, on the night his new position was finalized, was take Lily out for pizza at the place near their apartment that she'd been begging to go to for months, the one with the arcade games in the back that he'd never quite had the budget for. He let her play as many rounds of skee-ball as she wanted. He watched her laugh, watched her win a fistful of tickets she'd trade for a plastic dinosaur she didn't need, and he thought about Sarah, about how much she would have loved seeing this, about the 6 years of night classes and the garage full of second-hand monitors and every moment he'd almost quit and didn't. He thought about the professor at Houston Community College, a retired aerospace engineer named Mr. Alvarez, who used to stay 40 minutes after class just to work through problems with him because he could tell Daniel actually wanted to understand, not just pass. Daniel had emailed him the week before with the whole story. Mr. Alvarez wrote back 4 words. Told you so, kid. There's a version of this story where the point is that a billionaire's son got humbled and lost his job, and sure, that happened, but that's not really what it's about. It's about the quiet ones, the ones who clock in early and leave late and never once get to explain themselves in the room, because nobody thought to ask. It's about how a 2-year degree from a community college and a 4-year degree from an Ivy League school can sit next to each other on paper and mean absolutely nothing about who actually understands the problem in front of them. Daniel Cole didn't need NASA to prove he was smart. He already knew that. What NASA gave him was something different, something rarer, the simple, overdue experience of being asked for by name, in a room full of people who mattered, not because of where he'd come from, but because of what he'd built while nobody was watching. And somewhere in Houston, a little girl with 2 missing front teeth was starting to understand, in the way kids eventually do, that her father had been quietly extraordinary the entire time.